Peace. How are you?
Hey, peace. Can you hear me?
Word up. How are you, Zion?
I'm doing good, brother. I'm doing good.
Let me try to get my camera open. Hold on, I thought it was open. Maybe this will work so the people can see. Thanks for coming in. Is I think this we built before, but this your first time on my show, right?
I think I've been on your show before, like in the back chat, like when you have a bunch of people on. But where we probably will take it, yeah, this might essentially be the first
Yeah,
time.
word up. Well, thank you. I welcome you. Thank you for tapping in, making another wonderful moment in the community. And so I think you heard some of my stuff that I was saying already. So I'll just let you start out with the floor. You know what I'm
I appreciate it. First thing I want to say is that I respect Jonathan Owens, aka Smash Rockwell, tremendously, and that's not a brown nose statement. As Jonathan knows very well, I'm a straight shooter, as I believe he is too.
and that's
Uh,
mutual. That's mutual respect.
Having said that, we've crossed paths before. We've met in person more than once. Kendall and Child, the vaccine debate. Like we've seen each other in person at different events, and I've always showed Jonathan love, and he's always shown me love, even when we have differences. And I think that's remarkable. And that's one of the reasons why it's so easy to have a dialogue with you, even when we disagree, because we don't treat our disagreements personally, you and I. And I would love to see the community join and do that. So having said that, I do want to make something a little bit clear, Jonathan, because you said that and I'm paraphrasing, so please don't judge me too much for not saying what you said verbatim. I'm paraphrasing, but you said Hebrews have a tendency because they really can't find themselves in history. What they do is they name themselves after this people group or that people group, like they make themselves part of the Sumerians here. And I'm paraphrasing. I know you didn't say that exactly. And I want to remind you of something that I think you are aware of, but I think as I say it, it might make a little bit more sense. Do remember, Jonathan, that it's part of the biblical narrative that the Hebrew story doesn't begin in Canaan land, but it begins with Abraham, who exists in the region of Sumer. And I have to say the region of Sumer because even though Abraham is 2000 BC, at the time that he's born, he's living during what's called the Sumerian Renaissance period, which is a renaissance or resurgence in culture. So I think it's important, Jonathan, that when you speak about the connection that Hebrews make with Sumerians, it's important to not say or suggest that this is due to Hebrews not having tangible evidence to find themselves in history, and therefore wanting to attach themselves to any older or antiquated people group. I think it's important to remember that it's built in the biblical narrative that the Hebrew story begins with Abraham, who has his inception in that region. That's what I wanted to say first, and then I wanted to hear your thoughts.
Well, let me just say that's fair enough. You know what I'm saying? That's fair enough. And so when we talk about well, we don't want some form of apologetics against the polemic mounted against the Hebrews in ancient times. We start to see refudiations by those like Josephus and other people who were right to say that the egregious things that people said, well, not egregious things, but the things concerning the antiquity of the Hebrews in ancient times, it was the same thing, so to speak. It would be those who espouse the Hebrew tradition showing no, this was us, so to speak, in ancient times and going over different groups of people. I'm sure you're familiar with Josephus' works and how
Yeah,
he
yeah.
had to discuss what some people said about the hike soaks and whatever. So this is both sides of this argument that we take is not new or limited to us. When we deal with Abraham at the time he would have supposedly lived, and if we actually look into the archaeology we got left from those time periods, we will see that they had what was called the ziggurat to Ur, or whatever. I think a ziggurat of the ziggurat of Ur, and in that ziggurat, it was actually veneration to an Akkadian deity, Sinana. Okay, and so at that time, I am familiar with the Sumerian Renaissance, but I think they say something about what 2091 or something for Abraham, something around there. If we was just looking at, I think that's him going into Egypt, or what have we. If we was just looking at dates they got online, well, again, the archaeology we find in the area, it proves that Akkadians had kind of like prevailed in the region, and so I don't think it's unfair for you to say that there is that narrative is rooted in the biblical story. But when we probe things, we look at the biblical story and the extra biblical and start to weigh things.
That's a good point. If I could counter that, I want to say this. Let's consider what the biblical narrative says, right? Let's begin with the genesis of the biblical narrative, which is essentially the Torah, right? Jonathan is a very, very um, uh, intellectually wise and aware person when it comes to the books of the Bible. So when I say Torah specifically in his hearing, he knows I'm speaking about the first five books, which is the genesis and foundation of the Hebrew tradition and narrative. In that testament, in the tradition, right, you don't see comparisons with Canaanite culture in their cosmology. For instance, the Canaanites don't have a creation story of 7 days, of a god fashioning man out of clay. Those are stories that are rooted in Sumer. Um, the cultural traditions of the Hebrews, while you might find resemblance to Canaanite culture, and I think that's more so as a result of the Hebrews living there, for the most part, the Hebrew traditions, stories that they tell, right, their religious narrative, it echoes traditions that are taught and spoken in Sumer, right? So I think it's important to weigh the archaeological evidence, right, which is at the end of the day, that's important for all schools of thought, but it's also significant to consider the biblical narrative because that would be the voice of the voice of the people, which is important for an archaeologist, right? An archaeologist understands what's called subjective data. Subjective data is any data that I interpret thousands of years removed from when these things are happening. That's subjective because I'm adding my onus and opinion, but I'm so many years removed that my opinion is more so subjective. What scholars and archaeologists really look for is objective data, which comes in the best form of the writings of those people. So this is why the biblical narrative is also crucial in discussing who the Hebrews are, how we are to perceive of them, and then we're supposed to marry that with the historical record or the archaeological record. So I think that when you mesh the two together, that's where these stories come together and make more sense. I don't really disagree with much of what you heard. I definitely came in about 5 minutes before you see me comment. So that means I haven't been on your live long. I just saw it. I also don't know how long you've been on. I did come on to hear you make the mention that Hebrews have the tendency to make themselves Sumerians because they really can't find themselves in history. Which for me, I had to point out that even with the Sumerians, and this is a perfect time to say this, right? Even with the Sumerians, what a lot of people don't know, and I wish Chuck Morgan, if he's Chuck, if you're live listening, please join the link so you can add to this as well or subtract. At the end of the day, your impetus is respected and valued. But watch this. When you go and delve into the narrative of the biblical Hebrews, you find a lot of interesting variables that are told as it relates to world history. And I think one of the things that we lose sight of when we talk about the Sumerians, people treat it as if at the time that the Sumerians existed as a people group, that there was no one else living in the same region. You got to remember Sargon the Great and conquers the Sumerians and creates the Akkadian Empire. He served under the Sumerians. A lot of people forget that he was a general and he's a Semite. So it should be clear then that Semites were also part of the Sumerian civilization. A lot of people haven't studied Sumer enough to even know that. And that's important to note. People act as if when the Akkadians came and conquered Sumer, that they just went from the remote north all out of the blue, came and conquered, not understanding the intimate history that Sargon was part of the political empire, and maybe I shouldn't say empire, but part of the political conglomerate of the Sumerians because he served as a general under them. And that
That
was
could
how
be
it was
true. That could be
not
true.
well,
But I
yeah,
just want to point it out that, and so people following are because somebody say Sergeant the who? He said
Sargon,
Sargon for people following us, the Akkadian. Now, just let's stop right there for a moment because we know there's two Sargons,
yes.
and this is me just going in my memory. I thought Sargon the Great that I could be wrong, and I always could be wrong. So that's the humility I approach it with. I'm not coming like trying to catch you up. So we trying to clear this up for what we teaching. I thought Sargon the second was the one that get the accolades for being Sargon the Great, and I thought maybe that it was him ruling under. We could fact check ourselves right now, and we could feel free to. I could open it up and we could pull it up, or you can, to see which Sargon exact. I remember writing an article on it, and it was called "Let Sargons Be Sargons." But I mean, it was like "Let bygones be bygones," but I was making a play on that, and it was actually pointing to the fact that we do have two different Sargons in
Yes.
history,
Hence
and
why
it's
hence why
Sargon the
one
second though that they line up and that they talking about.
yeah,
Sargon the first would have been a complete enemy of Kemet because he took and did what he did. I mean, not Kemet. I apologize. Of Samaria because of the tales that we have left on the stela of
yeah.
how he treated them. But I could be wrong. So we probably, if somebody in the chat want to fact check that too, we could see. But I do know what you're saying is true. That at one of those Sargons was like an underling to the people he took over.
That's a fact. So Sargon the first, who I won't say many, but some scholars also construe as great. And I'll explain and clarify or validate why it's necessary to refer to Sargon the First and Sargon the Great as well. Um, Modern scholars typically refer to Sargon the Second as Sargon the Great. Um, and that's due to a lot of things that involve archaeological data and what that data has to say. However, from a pure historical point of view, Sargon the First did more than Sargon the Great, so to speak, or Sargon the Second, because Sargon the First is the world's first empire builder. Let's never forget that. He builds the world's first empire, and his empire stretches from Sumer all the way down to Egypt. It's recorded in the annals of Sargon that Egypt was a vassal state under Sargon the First. And it's in that respect that people regard him as Sargon the Great because he's the world's first empire builder. Hence, he would be the world's first emperor. So that's why you have, and I would admit, a minority of scholars will still relegate that title to him. But I want to still make something clear. While that's a valid topic to discuss, I don't want to blur the lines because there's something important in what I initially said. Sargon the First, whom I'm also describing as Sargon the Great, was part of the Sumerian Empire because Semites were also in the Sumerian region. And this is how he was able to take over Sumer from within because Semites had been living there. In Samuel Noah Kramer's book, The Sumerians, in the latter chapters, and I do have the book here to bring out the references, by the way, he does let you know, rightfully so, that the place names that Sumerians are giving to various regions are not from the Sumerian language. The oldest quote unquote Sumerian place names are Semitic. Scholars are baffled. Assyriologists are baffled by that because if the oldest place names for Sumerian regions are Semitic names, that would highly validate that there was a strong Semite presence in pre-civilized Sumer, which there's data to suggest now. We know that through the earlier cultures that come through that region. And by
So
the
I
way,
just would ask, like,
let me get the book, by the way, because I
yeah,
want to
yeah,
show you
because I
the
was about to
reference.
ask who say that. Yeah, yeah, which
That's
scholar say that.
Samuel Noah Kramer in the book The Sumerians. I have it in my bedroom. I'll be right back.
It's all good. And feel free to tap in, y'all, if y'all want to build. We got the good brother Zion Lexx in the build. You know what I'm saying? We straight some of this discussion out. And that's what's up. And so I don't want to respond with him not there, but I want to holler at y'all. So okay, cool. And so Yeah, go right ahead. Go right ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. You got his headphones. All right, yeah, go right ahead.
All right, so I'm gonna pull up the page for you right now. And what I love about this is, and I can even hear it from Jonathan's side. Nobody's here arguing to try to make oneself bigger or greater than the other. I think the way that scholars really thug it out is let the information speak for itself. Because when we do that, sometimes we find that we learn in that moment. We learn something that we never came across.
You're right. And so, just while you're looking that up,
Yeah.
you made a point about Sargon being. I think he was the cupbearer, if
Okay.
that's correct, to
Oh, okay.
Lugal
Okay.
Zagassi. And you're right. I think that might have been the first. And they say he came up. And so that if we using that as evidence to Akkadians being in the area, that's definite. That would definitely be good evidence. Also, we would have evidence of the writing system, some of the, like you said, but one claim I hope we pulling up is the one about the oldest place names
Yes.
being
Yes.
in the Akkadian language, because that just would appear like an anomaly to me, seeing that
Well,
we, just real quick, that we know that like I pointed out earlier, Sumerian was a language isolate, and if they were there at a time period that allowed their language to develop isolated, I know they would have had to have some names for the location that they were at.
oh yeah. So in the book, the writer doesn't posit that the language is Akkadian, right? That he just simply says Semite. Oftentimes we connect the oldest Semitic language being Akkadian, but that's not even altogether accurate because there are Semites that live in regions that have older cultures than Akkadian, right? And they're
But they
speaking
just
a
ain't found
Semitic
the
language.
language for language classification, right? So
Right,
if we
right.
look in academia, they're gonna take Semitic back to Akkadian, right?
That's a fact. That's a fact. That's a fact. We have no disagreement there. But what I'm saying is, and as you know, you can have a consensus on something, but if you specialize in an area, sometimes you can go further than consensus because consensus doesn't always mean that whatever they come together to agree upon, if there's no other information that might suggest something greater or otherwise. So as you know, for instance, I'll give us for consensus. Many Egyptologists, their consensus used to be that the Egyptians were an Afro-Asiatic people, and with even some maybe Indo-Aryan elements. Right, that one time that was a consensus, but there were several scholars that knew and were aware at that time that that was incorrect. So that's what I'm saying. Sometimes when you specialize in an area, you can go deeper to see certain things.
Okay.
All right. Just allow me to pull up the quote. In the
No, it's
meantime, you
all
can
good.
definitely do what you do.
Yeah. Then I want to show you what I thought I found on the. Eventually, I'll show you what I thought I found on that Mern Pastel,
Um,
because
my second point, though, is to share my screen now and say this. I made mention to you that in the book The Sumerians, although at the time I couldn't find the page, in the book The Sumerians, Samuel Noah Kramer makes reference to the oldest place names in Sumer all being Semitic in origin, every single last one of them. And scholars are saying it alike, not him alone. So it's not his own unique idea. The only problem is at the time I said that to Jonathan, I didn't have the citation handy, but I can see it now. And I also have it shared on my screen. So let me do this first. I'm pulling up an article. The article is called The Sumerian Problem. I'm going to copy that. Oh, I can't paste it because this is your Zoom. Could I paste it on here, Jonathan, even though it's your Zoom? Just that way your audience can follow? Can I
what
paste it
happened?
in the
Yeah, hell
chat?
yeah, yeah. What you say? You can do whatever you please. But what you say?
Okay, so the first thing I want to show is this article called The Sumerian Problem. Midway in the article, and I'm going to highlight it, it says, scholars have identified many Semitic names among the place names used by the Sumerians for some of the greatest cities. Uruk, Eridu, Kish are but a few of these. This could mean that they moved into places that they were already settled, or it could mean that they kept the place names given to these cities by their conquerors, the Akkadians and Elamites, after regaining their independence. The Elamites, though, were also a non-Semitic speaking people. Identified names are Semitic. The point that I'm making by showing this article first before I show the citation in the book is to show that scholars are saying this. It's not one scholar alone. It's multiple scholars that are saying this, that the oldest place names to describe that the Sumerians are using to describe their oldest places are all Semitic, which would then show a strong pre-Semitic population in Sumer before Sumer comes into this big world conglomerate that we know it to be at that time in history. Now I'm going to show my citation from the book itself. So this is the book, page 42, The Sumerians by Samuel Noah Kramer. I already have it highlighted so you guys can see that I've had this up. Then again, even the oldest Sumerian inscriptions contain a number of Semitic loanwords, and the Sumerian pantheon contains not a few deities which are of Semitic origin. Some of these borrowings may reach the very early days. Finally, the first dynasty of Sumer, whose existence can be historically attested, at least to some extent, the so-called first dynasty of Kish, which according to the ancients themselves, followed immediately upon the subsidence of the flood, begins with a whole group of rulers who all bear Semitic names. So that was the point that I was making to you earlier when we connect Hebrews with Sumer. What a lot of people don't know is that there was a strong Semite population among the people that you know as the Sumerians. Sargon the First, conqueror of the Sumerian civilization, he also was immersed among them as many other Semites were. And I'm using this book now to also lay the foundation and show that scholars agree that the oldest Sumerian inscriptions bear Semitic loanwords, and even the deities worshipped by Sumerians are borrowings from the Semitic culture. Lastly, the kings, the earliest kings in the region of Sumer, bear names that are Semitic. That's powerful to point out.
Yeah, that's and I mean, I don't think you find no contention there. You made some very good points, and then you found that source. So